Hi, welcome to the second lecture of ARCHLine.XP 2022 Intermediate Course, the Visual Design Workshop. I recommend this workshop for those who are already confident in using what they learned in the rendering lecture of the preliminary course and want to take their visual design to a higher level. In today's sessions, we will work on a project by Kristina Harosi. I open the project. From ARCHLine.XP Draw Intermediate Course Rendering folder, I select Harosi Kristina Start file. I'm activating 3D window. I'm going to work here. First, let's look at the prepared renders in the lecture folder. We will compare two images and see the differences. You will find this folder in ARCHLine.XP Draw. The first picture created right after finishing the design. Here I have not set up the materials, not paid attention to the correct perspective setting, or made 25-30 test renders. Before the second final rendered image, I made 25-30 test renders. During the process, I paid attention to all adjustments necessary to produce a photorealistic image. Let's look at the steps needed to create a photorealistic image. The first is to set the perspective. In the first image, I have chosen a diagonal perspective setting. I wanted to get as much of the scene as possible, but I could only achieve an insignificant scene. The camera and the subject are not at the same height, so the walls are tilted and not parallel to each other. In the second picture, the perspective is completely perpendicular to the opposite wall. The walls are parallel and the camera and the subject are at the same height. This value is idle between 1000 mm and 1400 mm. Here it is set to 1100 mm. The second important step is to set the sun position. If we look at the first picture, we can see that here the sun is shining in very strongly with a very low sun position. The parquet floor is overexposed, creating a huge contrast between the light and the dark areas. If we look at the second picture, we have a very subtle transition with the sun is just barely hitting the room since we are working with a high sun position. The third important step is to set the render styles, including fine-tuning of the materials. This is a very important step. It is not enough to just apply the normal render style to a given material, it's worth fine-tuning them. For example, a parquet render style might work well on one object, but on another object it might be too reflective and need some fine-tuning. Look at the window, for example. If we zoom in, we can see that it is completely reflective, and in the second picture, we've moved the reflection completely, because we are looking at the scene from the front, and the sun is shining in from there, so we don't need the glass to be reflective. The next step that we are going to do is to set up the artificial lights. So if we look at the left side, the dark areas are nicely lit by the artificial lights. These are the 4 points that we are going to go through to get this photorealistic image. Let's go back to the program and get started. Let's first look at the perspective setting. As I said, the perspective is set diagonally, which is why the scene is so insignificant. And we are looking down from above, which compresses the space. And even the camera is set to a wide angle, resulting a deformed scene. So let's set the perspective. On the navbar, I click on the eye icon and set the view perpendicular to the opposite wall. I also set the camera and the object height to 1100 mm each and leave the angle at 60 degrees. This way, the walls are not distorted. By clicking on the 3 dots, I can change further view settings. Now I'm going to rewrite these values to get the same setting as the final render. So the exposition of the camera and the object should both be 600 mm. The Y position of the camera is 5800 mm and the object is -200 mm. I have already set the Z position, so I won't change it. I click OK to accept. Then click Save to override the view. Let's look again at the picture. We will compare this with the final one. We can see that this is also a skewed viewpoint, but it is still perfectly acceptable. The important thing is that it is not a diagonal and the height of the camera and the object are the same. Only deviate from this value if you are creating a visual for a smaller room. Now let's continue working on the model. We will start with the first phase, where we will filter the model and work only with the architectural elements. To do this, I activate the floor plan window and select the layer walk. I select only architectural elements and then rebuild the model. I create a test rendering. I run an integrated render in draft mode and select a lower resolution of 854 by 480. I start rendering. It is completed. Let's see what we need to change. As we can see, the glass is completely reflective and we can see the door behind us. If we look at the sun, we see the same strong contrast as in the first picture. So this needs to be adjusted. First, I'll adjust the north direction. On the bottom status bar, I select the north icon and set it to 90 degrees. Using the view shadow simulation, I can simply adjust the position of the sun. I set the date for 18 May and the time for 8:30 in the morning. Now that I have used the highest sun position, it is barely shining in. I'm going to close the rendering. Let's compare two images again. Let's look at the final rendering and the image 21 side by side. As we have already discussed, the light is very strong in this picture. Almost the whole scene is dominated by sunlight. It is also a bit overexposed, and there is a strong contrast at the edge of the shadows. In the second image, we get a subtle transition, so it is important to find the right light-shadow balance. Let the light come from ahead and not from behind us, and don't let the sun dominate the view. I go back to the model to set the render styles. Styles can be found under Design Center Catalog's Render Styles. I drag the wall render style onto the wall, the glass render style on the window, and the metal render on the window frame. The flooring gets the parquet render style. The patio tiling will have the matte render style, as it will get a lot of sunlight. And for the fine-tuning, I'm going to make it darker. To do this, I change the view and drag the render style onto it. Then go back to the saved view. It is also very important to use good resolution, high-quality materials, preferably seamless patterns. In the first lecture, we discussed what a seamless pattern is and if we cannot download one from the internet, how we can create one. We also discussed the possibility of using PBR materials. The parquet, for example, is a PBR material whose properties we will look at in the fine-tuning section. But first let's compare two more images. These will be pictures 22 and 23. These two pictures show us why we need to pay attention to the saturation of the materials as well. In the image on the left, the wood has a very strong saturated yellowish effect. We can texture this very easily in an external image editor, and the result is shown in the picture on the right. Let's go back and continue. I create a standalone rendering with interior complete preset, and the resolution should remain 854 by 480. I set the light sampling rate to a lower value to reduce render time. Let's make it 24. In addition, we import panorama image. The panorama images completely surround the model, so they give a much more realistic render, as we will see different details of it from different windows. If we choose a panorama, we must specify its direction. I start rendering. It is done. Let's see what fine-tuning we need to do to get a good result. As I have mentioned several times, the reflection on the window must be reduced, as the current position of the sun wouldn't create reflections. The fascia tiling is overexposed, so I need to make it darker. Finally, I will fine-tune the reflection of the parquet flooring. I save this image. Let it be called Render 1. I exit and start fine-tuning. Let the wall be the first. I right-click on it, then find Material. Properties will appear on the left. The albedo should be 59. The reflection is 0. No refraction is needed, so I set it to 1. The bump mapping should be 3. The softness should be 18. I continue with the parquet. After right-click and find Material, I can see the properties. As I mentioned, the parquet is a good quality PBR material. We can see this from the diamond icon beside it, and because the material properties are described by texture images. So we can set its properties not only with values, but also with different textures. Let's fine-tune it. The albedo should be 75, the reflection 15. I change the roughness to 10%, the refraction should be 1.4. I set the bump mapping to 15 and the softness to 25. The next should be the door frame material. I will also look for the material used in the model. I set its albedo to 48 and its reflection to 20%. The roughness will be 11%, the refraction is 1.4. Finally, I set the bump mapping and the softness to 0. Now comes the glass. The transparency should be 100%. As I said, no reflections. Also, no refraction, so I set it to 1. The last material is the fascia tiling. I'm going to switch views and look for the material. The only thing I change is the albedo. It should be dark enough to avoid exposure. Let's change it to 12. I restore the saved view. I start a standalone rendering with the same settings as the previous image had. We skip the weighting. Let's look at the completed image from the folder and compare it to the image without fine-tuning. In the picture on the right, the glass is no longer reflecting, and the fascia is not overexposed. Let's get back to work. In the meantime, the rendered image is done. So I save it to the folder as Render 2 and close the window. We have now reached phase 2, where we will deal with the furniture. We will set their render styles and fine-tune their materials. To do this, I activate the floor plan view, then in the layer walk, I select the layers of the furniture, meanwhile pressing the Ctrl key. I rebuild the 3D model. Let's start setting render styles on the materials. I go back to the Design Center Render Style Catalog. I drag a parquet render style onto the cabinet. The sofa, the picture, the cushion, the rug, the dining chairs, and the little ottoman are all getting fabric render style. What I still need to adjust is the style of the legs of the sofa and the dining chairs. These will have mirrored render style. Now let's make a test rendering. When working with furniture, it's a good idea to zoom in on it so that we can get a good quality render at a low resolution and see what fine-tune adjustments we need to make. So I start a standalone rendering with the same settings. We skip this one too, but we'll look at the final result in the folder. We can see that this textile material should be a little rougher, and the reflection and the refraction of the metal legs should be reduced. Let's make the changes. I close the renderer and go back to the 3D view. Let's start with the sofa. Right-click on it, then find Material. I set the albedo to 50. Reflection should be 0%, refraction 1, bump mapping should be 9, and the softness can stay at 40. Let's continue with the cushions. I'll adjust both cushions in the same way. The albedo will be 57, refraction is 1, and the bump mapping is 5. I set other cautions as well. Albedo 57, refraction 1, bump mapping 5. Next is the dining chair. I set the albedo 57, the refraction to 1. Let's continue with the carpet material. Here the albedo should be 45, refraction 1, the bump should be 15 and the softness can stay at 40. Finally, set the legs material. The albedo should be 20, reflection 4%. The roughness should be 8%. The refraction is 1.56 and the bump mapping and the softness should be 0. By the way, you will find these values in the tutorial. Let's also look at the material of the chair legs. Here I only need to change the refraction to 1.56. I run another detailed test render with the previous settings. Let's look at the final result in the course folder. This will be image number 35. This is not a high-quality rendered image yet, but it helps the process to get a good quality photorealistic view. Let's continue with the third phase, setting up the decoration render styles. But before that, let's insert an intermediate phase, where we will deal exclusively with the lights and their light sources. I close the renderer and activate the floor plan view. I select the lights layer 2 in the layer walk. I rebuild the 3D model. By default, these also need to have their render style adjusted and the materials fine-tuned. But we have already done that for this model, so we'll just deal with the light source. I'll start a test rendering with the lights off. To do this, I first select all lights in the 3D window. Then from the side menu, I switch to light sources. Here we can turn the light sources on and off. We can leave this on, as the Enable Artificial Lights option in the render settings will override this. I start a standalone rendering and disable the artificial lights. I'll start rendering. We are not going to wait for that either, we are going to look at the final result in the course folder. This will be image number 41. We can see that there are darker areas on the image that will be illuminated by artificial lights. I close it and stop the test rendering. Let's turn the lights on. To do this, all I have to do is to enable the artificial light in the render settings. Since we have all lights on, they will light up in the rendered image as well. I will not start this rendering now, but we'll look at the final result in a moment. This is image number 42. We can see that all artificial light sources are now on and they are beautifully illuminating the darker areas. However, we won't need overhead lighting at the table, as there is enough natural light coming in from outside. I select two lights and turn them off under the Light Sources menu. I'll start another rendering. Even in this picture, we already can see that there is enough light without the light sources being on. Let's take a look at the end result of this one and compare these three pictures we had generated before. This is the first one we made, where we hadn't had our artificial light sources turned on. The second one, where we have already turned on all light sources. The third one where we turned off the lamps above the table, because we can see that there is actually enough natural light coming into the scene. I close the images and the renderer. Let's continue with the decorative elements. Activating the floor plan, I go into the layer walk and select all layers, then rebuild the 3D model. On decorative elements, we also need to go through the steps of the render style setting and fine-tuning the materials. But these are also pre-made, so all that's left is to create the test render. Before I start the rendering, I show you something. I choose View Rendering, Render Frame Off On. Maximize the 3D window and set a clean screen. We can see that the render frame appears. This frame's dimensions are based on the resolution values we had set in the rendering properties. This helps us to see which part of the scene will be visible on the image and which will fall outside of it. I reset the view and start a standalone complete rendering. I choose a higher resolution, HD quality 1280 by 720. The light sampling rate can remain 24. I will start the rendering, which we will wait out. This will take a little longer as we have chosen a higher resolution, but at this stage it is worth waiting to see if we need to make any further adjustments to the materials. The rendered image is done. I save it to the folder, name it Render 3. Let's look at the effects. In the preliminary course, we have already learned that the first thing to do is always set the exposure. I change this to 352. Then I take the saturation back a bit by 5. I also adjust the shadows and the midtone to 12. I also save this to the folder under the name Render 4. We can run one last test render with a light source sampling set higher, but if we see that the material settings are all correct, we might as well make the final render. For the final render, I set the light sampling rate to 128. The higher this value, the better the quality. I set the resolution to 1920 by 1080 Full HD quality and start rendering. This will take much longer as I've chosen Full HD resolution and I've also set high light sampling rate. I skip it, but we'll see the results. But before that, let's go through the images again and recap the steps. We start from the picture number 31. So the rendering is divided into 3 phases. The first phase, when we were only dealing with the architectural elements. We can see this in the first picture. We have added render styles to the materials, but we haven't fine-tuned them yet. In the next picture, we have finished the fine-tuning. In the second phase, we worked on the furniture. We also set the render style for these and then fine-tuned the materials. The third phase was to adjust the decorative elements materials. We have separated the lamps and the decorations. First, we activated the lamps layer and created a render without the artificial lights. We saw that there were some dark areas, so we turned up the lights on the next render. These illuminate the darker areas nicely. We also noticed that it is completely unnecessary to turn on the lights above the table, as there is enough natural lights coming into the scene. So for the next render, we turn these lights off and then choose a higher resolution. Then we work with the same resolution but with the effects already set. And then we did the final render and set the effects on that as well. As a final step, I would suggest that you load the final visual design into an image editor and do some post-processing. This way, you can produce an even better quality photo. You can see it in this picture. This brings us to the end of this workshop. I hope you found it useful. I look forward to seeing you at the next one on architectural design. Until then, have a nice day. Bye.